Imagine yourself stepping onto the creaking deck of a medieval ship. The salty wind stings your face, ropes groan under tension, and the vast, endless sea stretches in every direction. At first, it might feel like an adventure, a journey into the unknown. But before long, you'd realize this isn't the romantic voyage of storybooks. This is survival. Life aboard a medieval ship was harsh, unforgiving, and often unbearable for anyone not hardened to the sea. Tonight, we'll drift back through time and uncover why you probably wouldn't last even a single day on a medieval sea voyage. Welcome, friend, to History for Sleep. This channel is designed to help you unwind with the calming rhythm of history. Perfect for those who struggle to drift off at night. If you enjoy relaxing historical journeys like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a voyage into the past. And I'd love to hear from you. Comment below what parts of history fascinate you most, or when you like to listen, while falling asleep, during a quiet afternoon, or just when you need a peaceful escape. Tonight's story will take you across stormy seas, cramped wooden decks, and into the daily struggles of medieval sailors. We'll explore the food they ate, the diseases they battled, the dangers they faced from storms and pirates, and the sheer physical exhaustion that made every voyage a brutal test of endurance. This won't just be a quick glimpse. Over the course of this journey, we'll go deep through 18 chapters, each exploring a different aspect of life at sea. Think of it as a long voyage of your own, one that you don't have to endure, only imagine. All you need to do is close your eyes, let the sound of the story wash over you, and allow sleep to carry you off like a gentle tide. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to find out why a medieval sea voyage was one of the toughest experiences in human history. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Setting Sail. The harsh reality of boarding a medieval ship. The morning of departure was always a scene of mixed emotions. For those standing on the shore, watching their loved ones step onto the swaying deck of a medieval ship, there was a sense of pride and dread in equal measure. The voyage promised adventure and the possibility of riches. But it also carried with it the very real risk of never returning. Imagine yourself among the sailors called to embark. The ship before you seems massive, a forest of masts and rigging, but when you look closer, you realize it is simply planks of wood held together with tar and rope, already creaking against the tide. It is not the mighty fortress you hoped for. It is fragile, vulnerable, and soon it will carry you far from land. As you approach the vessel, the smell hits you first. The sharp tang of salt water mixes with the sticky scent of tar, used to seal the wooden hull against leaks. That alone is strong enough to sting the nose, but layered over it are the less pleasant odors of humanity and animals. Chickens cluck nervously from wicker cages, pigs squeal, and horses shuffle uneasily, waiting to be hoisted aboard. These creatures are not cargo in the modern sense, but traveling companions, destined for food or labor during the voyage. Already, you sense that this will not be a clean or comfortable journey. The smell of manure mingles with the sweat of men who have been working since dawn, hauling ropes, carrying barrels of salted meat, stacking sacks of grain. You climb the gangplank, and the deck groans underfoot. It is crowded, not only with crew, but with passengers if the ship is bound for trade or pilgrimage. Everyone is pressed close together, jostling for space, their possessions piled at their feet. There is no privacy, no quiet corner to retreat to. Every inch of the deck and the space below has a purpose, and most of those purposes are not related to comfort. The air feels damp, heavy with sea mist, and already you are aware that there will be no escape from the elements. Rain, spray, wind, and the burning sun will all have their way with you in the coming days. The sailors themselves look hardened, their faces weathered and lined from years at sea. Many are missing teeth, some are scarred, and their clothes are patched and stained from long use. They do not smile at newcomers. Instead, they watch with a kind of quiet judgment, knowing that the untested will soon reveal themselves when the sea shows its true power. You might feel a flutter of excitement, but also a heavy knot of fear. The shore is still close. You can still smell the land, the faint scent of grass and soil drifting on the breeze. But that smell will vanish soon, swallowed by the endless expanse of salt and water. The captain calls orders, his voice rough and commanding. The sails must be raised, the ropes secured, the anchor pulled from the sand. Every movement is a chorus of labor. Men haul together in rhythm, grunting, their bare feet slipping on wet planks. The sails crack and fill with wind, and the ship lurches forward. Your stomach drops with the motion, a sensation both thrilling and unsettling. The cheering of those on shore fades, replaced by the creak of timbers and the slapping of waves against the hull. In that moment, land feels farther away than you imagined. Already, the world has narrowed to the space of the ship and the vast sea around it. The departure itself is exhausting. You are put to work immediately, no matter your experience. If you are a sailor, you know your tasks. Coiling ropes, hauling sails, scrubbing the deck. If you are a passenger, you are still expected to pull your weight. Even if only carrying supplies or keeping the animals fed, there is no room for idleness. The ship depends on constant labor, and every pair of hands counts. You feel the strain in your muscles. Unused to the endless repetition, the rope burns on your palms, the ache in your back. Already, you realize that comfort is not a word that belongs to life at sea. As the ship moves further from the coast, the air changes. The breeze is colder, sharper, and the waves grow taller. Your body struggles to adapt to the constant rocking, and your balance falters. The deck tilts unpredictably, pitching you against barrels or railings, and the sea spray soaks your clothes. For the unaccustomed, seasickness strikes quickly. Your stomach twists and churns, and soon you are heaving over the side, the bitter taste of bile mixing with the salt air. This humiliation is common, but no less miserable. The veteran sailors sneer or laugh, knowing they endured the same once, but offering no comfort. To them, it is a rite of passage, a trial you must survive. The sea itself feels endless. When you look to the horizon, there is nothing but gray water stretching in every direction. The comforting sight of land has vanished. You are now utterly dependent on the ship and those who guide it. The realization sinks deep. There is no turning back. Whatever lies ahead, storms, starvation, disease, you are committed to facing it. The fragility of your position becomes clear. One plank loosening, one sail tearing, one sudden storm, and everything could be lost. The ship is both your prison and your only hope. Night falls quickly at sea, the light fading into an inky darkness that feels heavier than anything on land. Lanterns flicker weakly against the wind, casting shadows across the deck. The sea glimmers with eerie reflections of moonlight, and the sounds intensify, the groan of wood, the slap of waves, the whine of ropes straining against the mast. For a first night at sea, sleep is nearly impossible. The ship never stops moving, never stops creaking. Every sound reminds you that you are floating in the middle of a vast and dangerous wilderness. The thought of sinking, of slipping beneath the waves into endless darkness, presses at the edge of your mind. Lying on the hard deck or in a cramped corner below, you feel the dampness seeping into your clothes. The air is thick and close, smelling of sweat, salt, and animals. Rats scurry in the shadows, bold in their search for crumbs. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries, perhaps a pilgrim family is aboard, or a sailor coughs harshly, a sound that suggests illness more than fatigue. You realize that this is not merely a journey. It is a trial of endurance, one that will test your body, mind, and spirit. And this is only the beginning. You have not yet faced the stale food, the foul water, the crushing labor, or the howling storms. But even here, on the first day, the weight of the voyage is clear. The sea does not forgive the unprepared. The ship is both sanctuary and torment, carrying you away from the safety of land into a world that demands everything from those who dare to sail it. Already, you wonder, how long could you last? 1 day? A week? For many, even a single day is too much. The medieval sea voyage is not adventure, it is survival. And you have only just begun. Chapter 2. Cramped Quarters, Living on the Deck and Below. The first night at sea quickly reveals just how little space there is for anyone aboard. When you first looked at the ship from the shore, it may have seemed large, even mighty. Its towering masts, full sails, and sturdy hull suggested strength and stability. But once you are on board, moving about and trying to find a place to sit or rest, you realize how small and confining it truly is. The ship is crowded with men, animals, barrels, ropes, and tools, every inch of it claimed for some practical purpose. Comfort is not a priority. The deck is alive with constant motion. Sailors run back and forth to adjust the rigging. Animals shift nervously in their pens. Passengers shuffle, trying to stay out of the way, huddling near their belongings. The space is narrow, broken by masts and hatches. Even when the deck appears open, it is rarely free for long. A new task always arises: hauling ropes, moving barrels, cleaning spills, and those who stand idle risk the anger of the crew. You soon learn to flatten yourself against the side when a group of sailors heaves past, carrying something heavy. Below deck is worse. The air is close, thick with the stench of sweat, damp wood, and rotting food. Light barely reaches these spaces. A few lanterns hang from beams, flickering weakly, their smoke adding to the choking air. The ceilings are low, forcing you to stoop as you move, and the beams seem to press down on you, as though the ship itself is crushing the life from those inside. You quickly discover that this place is less a living area and more a storage hold where people are squeezed in among barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and the personal belongings of the crew. Sleeping arrangements are crude. Some sailors have hammocks slung between beams, but there are not enough for everyone. Others sleep on thin mats, on benches, or directly on the hard planks. The wood is always damp, always cold, and it carries the smell of the sea. At night, the sound of snoring, coughing, and restless turning fills the darkness. Rats scuttle over the beams and along the floor, bold in their hunt for crumbs. They gnaw at ropes, chew through sacks of grain, and even crawl across the sleeping bodies of men. To them, this cramped and filthy place is paradise. Privacy is non-existent. You are always seen, always heard. Conversations overlap. Arguments spark quickly in the confined space, and every cough or groan echoes in the hollow wooden chamber. The air is filled with human noise grunts of effort, muttered prayers, drunken laughter, whispered fears. Even the act of relieving yourself is far from private. Most sailors simply use the edge of the ship or a bucket, and the smell lingers. For passengers unused to such conditions, it is shocking, humiliating, and deeply uncomfortable. A movement of the ship only makes matters worse. The constant rocking turns the cramped quarters into a shifting maze. Hammocks sway wildly, sometimes tipping their occupants onto the floor. Barrels roll if they are not tied securely. Water seeps in through the cracks, pooling in corners and soaking clothing and bedding. When storms rise, the below-deck space becomes unbearable, with water dripping from above and the timbers groaning as though the ship itself is about to break apart. The darkness is suffocating, the smell overwhelming. On deck, the conditions are no more forgiving. There is more air, yes, and the sight of the sky and sea offers some relief. But there is no protection from the elements. The sun burns without mercy, leaving skin red and blistered. The wind whips salt spray into your face, stinging your eyes and lips. Rain soaks everything, leaving clothes heavy and cold. At night, the chill sets deep into your bones, and no blanket seems enough. There is no escape from the weather. Whether above or below, you are always exposed to something harsh and unrelenting. The animals aboard add to the misery. Chickens flap and squawk in their cages, pigs grunt and squeal, and the smell of manure drifts constantly through the air. Horses, if carried for use in battle or trade, stamp nervously on the deck, their waste collected poorly and often washed about by the rolling of the ship. Cats prowl in search of rats, while dogs bark or whine, unsettled by the motion of the sea. These animals are valuable, sometimes essential, but they make life aboard even more chaotic, loud, and filthy. The close quarters also mean that tempers flare easily. With so little space to move or to be alone, small annoyances grow into heated arguments. A shove in passing, a spilled drink, a stolen piece of food, these can spark fights that must be quickly broken up before they spread. Sailors develop a thick skin, learning to ignore insults and endure discomfort, but passengers often struggle. The longer the voyage, the greater the strain. Friendships form, yes, but so do rivalries, and with nowhere to escape, tensions simmer constantly. For the body, the cramped quarters bring aches and illnesses. Backs ache from bending in the low-ceilinged holds. Legs cramp from lack of movement. Cuts and scrapes, common in such close and dirty quarters, fester easily. The damp air encourages coughs and colds, and the filth spreads disease. Sleep never feels deep or refreshing. The noise, the rocking, and the discomfort ensure that rest is always broken, always incomplete. Fatigue becomes a constant companion, weighing on every task. Even eating is done in these same cramped conditions. Meals are shared on deck when the weather allows, or below when storms drive everyone inside. There is no dining hall, no table, just a huddle of men tearing at hard bread and chewing salted meat in the dim light. The smell of food mixes with the stench of sweat and waste. Conversation is sparse, sometimes cut short by the need to leap up and haul ropes at a shouted order. Eating is not a pleasure, but a necessity, another chore to endure. For those unaccustomed to such living, the shock of these quarters is enough to break their spirits within days. There is no place to retreat, no moment of silence, no true comfort. You live pressed against others, breathing the same stale air, listening to the same endless sounds. The ship itself is alive with movement, but within its walls you are trapped. The cramped quarters grind down even the strongest will, reminding you with every passing hour that the voyage has only just begun, and already you long for the open space of land. This is the reality of life aboard a medieval ship. It is not the grand adventure of song or story, but a daily test of endurance, lived in conditions that no modern traveler would accept. And yet, for sailors of the time, this was ordinary, even expected. They endured it not for comfort, but for survival, for pay, or for duty. For you, stepping into their world, it is almost unimaginable. Yet here you are, sharing their quarters, learning why even a single day might feel like too much. Chapter 3. Food and water, barely enough to survive. It does not take long, once the voyage begins, for hunger and thirst to remind you of how fragile life is at sea. On land, food is a comfort, a daily certainty. Even in the humblest of homes, bread can be baked, water drawn fresh from a well, and meals eaten in peace. Aboard a medieval ship, however, food and drink are stripped of comfort. They are reduced to their simplest form, survival. At first, you may imagine that meals would be hearty, with sailors sharing steaming bowls of stew or fresh fish caught from the sea. But reality is far from that image. The diet aboard a medieval ship is one of monotony and hardship, a constant reminder of the limits of storage and preservation. Space on a vessel is precious, and food must last for weeks, even months, without rotting. That leaves very few options, and nearly all of them are unappetizing. The staple is hardtack, a kind of biscuit made only of flour and water, baked until it is as hard as stone. These biscuits are so tough that sailors often soften them by soaking them in water or ale, and even then they may break a tooth while biting down. To make matters worse, hardtack often carries unwanted passengers tiny weevils that infest the flour before baking and remain sealed inside. At first, the thought of eating insects may disgust you, but after enough days at sea, hunger dulls such worries. Sailors even joke that the worms add a bit of meat to the meal. Alongside the hardtack is salted meat, usually pork or beef, stored in barrels. The salt preserves it from rotting, but it also makes the meat tough, stringy, and overwhelmingly salty. To eat it, sailors boil it in water, creating a greasy broth that may be shared out in wooden cups. If the meat has spoiled despite the salt, as it often does, its foul smell fills the air long before it reaches your mouth. Yet there is no choice. You eat what is given, or you go hungry. Other foods include dried peas or beans, which can be boiled into a thin porridge, and sometimes dried fish. But fresh produce is rare. A few onions or cabbages may be taken aboard, but they spoil quickly, turning soft and slimy in the damp air. Fruit, if brought, disappears within the first few days, devoured before it can rot. For the rest of the voyage, meals are gray, bland, and repetitive. There are no spices beyond the salt of the meat. No sweet treats, no fresh bread, no variety. Day after day, you chew the same hard biscuit, the same salty meat, the same watery broth. Water is perhaps the greatest struggle of all. Fresh water is stored in barrels, but wood is never perfect. Over time, the water stagnates, turning foul. Algae may bloom in it, leaving a green scum on the surface. Worms and other creatures sometimes find their way inside. The smell is enough to make you gag, but thirst is stronger than disgust. Sailors drink it anyway, often pinching their noses or gulping it down quickly to avoid tasting it. After weeks at sea, even this foul water may run out. Then the crew must rely on rainwater collected in buckets and cloths during storms. Each drop is precious, sometimes fought over, always rationed. Ale and wine are also carried aboard, for they last longer than water. Barrels of weak ale are common, and though the drink is sour and flat, it is safer than the water once it turns. Wine is rarer, usually reserved for officers or passengers of wealth. Both are consumed sparingly, measured out to stretch as far as possible. Drunkenness is discouraged, for too much weakens the crew and leads to fights. But small amounts are taken daily, more out of necessity than pleasure. The act of eating and drinking aboard ship is rarely peaceful. Meals are not times of gathering and comfort, but brief pauses in labor. Food is handed out quickly, often eaten on deck if the weather is fair, or below in the dim, crowded space if storms rage. Men sit on barrels, crouch on planks, or stand with bowls in hand. There are no tables, no chairs, no cloths spread for dining. The smell of food mixes with the stench of animals, sweat, and waste. Rats scurry nearby, bold enough to dart in and steal crumbs. The noise of the sea, of ropes and sails, never ceases. Hunger gnaws constantly. The portions are small, carefully rationed, and rarely enough to feel full. The work, however, is heavy, demanding strength and stamina. The body craves more than it receives, and soon weakness sets in. Stomachs growl, tempers shorten, and thoughts of food become obsessive. Sailors dream of fresh bread, of roasted meat, of cool water from a spring. They speak of it often, their voices wistful, knowing that such luxuries lie far away, perhaps never to be tasted again. Illness often comes from the food and drink. Spoiled meat causes stomach cramps and sickness. Foul water spreads disease. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables leads to scurvy, a slow and dreadful disease. Gums swell and bleed, teeth loosen and fall, and the body weakens until even the smallest task becomes impossible. Sailors dread it, but they have no cure, only prayer and endurance. For the inexperienced, the diet of a medieval voyage is shocking. After only a few days, you feel the toll. Your mouth aches from chewing the hard bread. Your stomach churns from the greasy meat. Your throat longs for clean water, yet recoils at the taste of what you must drink. There is no escape, no alternative, only the same unchanging meals again and again. Sometimes, when luck favors the crew, fish are caught from the sea. Sailors drop lines or nets, hauling in slippery creatures that thrash and glimmer in the sun. These moments bring excitement, a brief taste of freshness amid the monotony. The fish are roasted over small braziers or boiled in pots, their smell filling the air with something almost pleasant. But these catches are rare, and the sea is not generous every day. Most of the time, the men return empty-handed, their hopes dashed. Special occasions may bring small comforts. A festival day or a holy feast might see an extra ration or a treat saved for the purpose. Perhaps dried fruit or a stronger drink. These are moments of joy, brief and fleeting, but they remind the crew that they are still human, not merely laboring machines. Yet such moments are rare, and the long stretches between them are filled with the same gray meals, the same foul drink. As the voyage stretches on, hunger becomes more than a physical ache. It becomes a weight on the mind, a constant presence that dulls thought and weakens spirit. The cramped quarters, the hard labor, the endless sea-all are made worse by the gnawing emptiness in the belly. The sailor learns to live with it, to ignore it, to press forward despite it. But for the unaccustomed, for someone like you, it is nearly unbearable. And so you begin to understand why food and water, the simplest necessities of life, were among the greatest challenges of a medieval voyage. It is not the storms, not the pirates, not even the disease that breaks many who try. It is the slow, grinding misery of meals that do not satisfy, of water that cannot refresh. Day after day, bite after joyless bite, sip after foul swallow, the voyage wears you down. And this is only the third challenge you have faced. The sea has many more to come. Chapter 4. Seasickness and Stomach Ailments for Many. The first and most relentless enemy at sea is not a storm, not hunger, nor even fear. It is the sea itself, rolling endlessly beneath the ship and turning the stomach upside down. Seasickness, that cruel companion of nearly every voyage, is perhaps the greatest reminder that the human body was never meant to live upon the water. For those new to sailing, it begins within hours, sometimes even minutes, after leaving the sight of land. The ship moves in ways the body does not understand. On land, your feet are steady, the ground firm beneath you. At sea, nothing is still. The deck sways beneath your feet, lifting you up and dropping you down as the waves pass. The horizon tilts unnaturally, and the constant rocking confuses your senses. Your inner ear, which keeps your balance, fights against your eyes, which see motion where your body expects stillness. The result is nausea-deep, persistent, and inescapable. At first, you may try to fight it. You breathe deeply, you look to the horizon. You tell yourself it will pass, but the sea has no mercy. The queasiness builds, rising like a tide within you. Soon you are clutching the railing, retching into the waves as the salty spray stings your face. The sailors laugh, for they have seen it countless times. To them, the sight of a new passenger bent over the side is as common as the rising sun. They may even offer crude advice: chew ginger, if any is available. Keep your eyes on the horizon, or simply let your stomach empty itself and hope you adjust. But few truly adjust quickly. The misery of seasickness is not only the vomiting, but the exhaustion it brings. Your body grows weak, your head heavy, your limbs limp. Every task becomes a struggle, every movement an effort. Eating becomes nearly impossible, yet hunger gnaws at you, for the work of the ship demands energy. The food, already unappetizing, turns to poison in your mouth when your stomach churns with every bite. Water or ale, swallowed to ease the dryness of the throat, is often brought up again within minutes. Your body rebels against all sustenance, leaving you trapped in a cycle of emptiness and sickness. Nor is there relief in the quarters below deck. If anything, the close, stifling air makes the sickness worse. The stench of sweat, damp wood, and spoiled food fills the lungs, and the rocking feels stronger in the darkness, where your eyes cannot focus on the horizon. Many who suffer retreat above, clinging to the railing in the wind and spray, preferring the chill and wet to the suffocation below. But even here, there is no escape. The sea does not pause, and neither does the sickness. Seasickness is not always a passing trial. For some, it lasts the entire voyage, day after endless day of nausea and weakness. These unfortunates waste away, their bodies thin and frail by the time the ship reaches land. They are mocked as useless, unable to work, yet pitied too, for their suffering is plain. To be constantly sick is to live in torment, with no cure and no end until the ship finally docks. Beyond seasickness, the stomach faces other torments aboard a medieval ship. The food itself, as described before, is often spoiled or infested. Eating such fare leads to cramps, diarrhea, and fevers. Dysentery spreads easily in the close quarters, leaving men doubled over in pain, their strength drained away. Buckets are used when men are too weak to reach the rail, but the stench of sickness fills the air, carried from one end of the ship to the other. With no fresh water to cleanse, no true medicine to heal, illness lingers and spreads. Constipation too is common, a less dramatic but equally painful problem. The hardtack and salted meat lack the freshness and fiber of land food, leaving bowels sluggish. Men strain in discomfort, groaning with the effort, while their bellies swell with trapped air. Complaints echo through the crew, for when one man suffers, the smell and sound of his misery affect them all. Add to this the indignity of relieving oneself at sea. There are no toilets, no privacy. Most simply squat over the side, gripping ropes for balance as the waves crash below. In rough seas, this is dangerous, even deadly. Many fall overboard in such attempts, lost to the water in the most humiliating of ways. Others use buckets, which are emptied hastily, their contents splashing back against the side of the ship. The process is messy, unsanitary, and always unpleasant. For newcomers, it is a shock. For veterans, it is merely another hardship to endure. The stomach also suffers from the constant imbalance of eating too little, yet working too hard. Meals are small, labor is endless, and the sea air seems to sap strength faster than land. Hunger gnaws even when food is eaten, for the body craves nutrients it cannot receive. Weakness follows, a dull, dragging exhaustion that never truly leaves. Every ache is magnified, every sickness harder to overcome. When storms rise, the suffering doubles. The ship pitches violently, waves crashing over the deck, and even the strongest stomachs rebel. Men stagger and slip, vomiting where they stand, the filth washed about by the water streaming across the deck. Below, the sickness multiplies in the darkness, the sound of retching echoing like a grim chorus. The smell becomes overwhelming, a mixture of bile, sweat, and fear. Sleep is impossible, food unthinkable, and thirst unquenchable. For days, sometimes, the crew lives in this misery, holding on not to comfort, but simply to survival. And yet, despite all this, the ship sails on. The sea does not care for the weakness of the human stomach, nor for the groans of those bent double in misery. Work must be done, sails must be hauled, ropes must be tied, and the ship must be kept afloat. Those too ill to rise are left lying where they fall, their tasks taken up by others, until strength returns or death claims them. There is no room for sympathy when survival is at stake. For someone like you, unused to such trials, Seasickness and stomach ailments would be enough to end the voyage on the first day. The thought of constant nausea, of foul water, of spoiled food and public indignity is nearly unbearable. Yet this was the daily life of medieval sailors. They endured it not because they were stronger than you, but because they had no choice. The sea demanded it, and they obeyed. So as you stand on the deck, clutching the railing, your stomach churning with every roll of the waves, you realize why so few could endure this life. It is not only the storms, not only the hunger or the danger. It is the body itself, rebelling against the endless motion, crying out in misery, while the sea laughs and carries you farther from land. This, more than anything, is why you would not last a day on a medieval sea voyage. Chapter 5. Disease and Death at Sea. If seasickness was a torment of the body and spoiled food a burden of the stomach, then disease was the greatest shadow that hung over every voyage. On land, illness was feared, but at sea, it became something far more terrifying. A medieval ship was a floating world, closed off and crowded, with no escape, no fresh air beyond the salted wind, and no clean water beyond what was stored in the barrels. In such conditions, disease spread quickly, silently, and often fatally. At the start of the voyage, when supplies were fresh and spirits high, sickness seemed a distant fear. But as days turned into weeks, the cracks appeared. A cough that did not fade, a fever that left a man shivering even in the sun, a sore that would not heal. One by one, crew members and passengers fell ill, and soon the ship was no longer only a vessel of travel, but a place of suffering. Scurvy was perhaps the most feared. No one aboard knew it by name, nor did they understand the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables that caused it, but its symptoms were unmistakable. First came the weakness, the sense that lifting ropes and hauling sails drained the body more than it should. Then the gums began to swell and bleed, teeth loosened, and sores appeared on the skin that refused to heal. The men grew pale, their legs swollen, and their spirits broken. Scurvy was not a swift killer, but a slow thief of strength, robbing men of their ability to work until they collapsed in their hammocks and faded away. Dysentery, however, was quicker and crueler. Spread through foul water and unsanitary conditions, it struck without warning. One day a man was strong, the next he was writhing in pain, his body emptied by violent sickness. The stench filled the ship, buckets overflowing, the groans echoing in the darkness below deck, leaving the sailor unable to stand, unable to work, and often unable to survive. Dysentery claimed many, not because it was always fatal, but because the body at sea was already weak, and every illness struck harder in those conditions. Fevers, too, were common, mysterious in their origin. A bite from a flea or a louse, an infected cut from rough rope. The spread of unseen germs in the crowded quarters, all could spark an illness that left men shaking, drenched in sweat and delirious with visions. Others huddled near, whispering prayers, for they knew fever often led to death. There was no medicine beyond herbs, no healer beyond the ship's carpenter or barber, who might attempt a crude bleeding or apply a poultice of whatever was available. More often than not, the efforts were useless, and the man was left to suffer until his body either recovered or gave way. The fear of disease was made worse by the closeness of life aboard. When one man coughed, all heard it. When one man groaned in pain, all felt the dread. There was no escaping a sickness once it took hold, no retreat to a safer place, no quarantine beyond pushing the ill to a corner of the ship. Everyone breathed the same air, drank from the same barrels, ate the same spoiled food. Illness was not only a personal trial, but a communal doom. And when death came, it came without ceremony. On land, the dead were buried in the earth, surrounded by family, marked with stone or wooden cross. At sea, there was no such luxury. The body, once it had cooled, was sewn into a piece of sailcloth, often with a heavy weight placed at the feet. The last stitch, it was said, passed through the nose to ensure the man was truly dead. Then, with a short prayer, the bundle was lifted to the railing, and with a heave, it was cast into the sea. The splash was final, the waves quickly swallowing the ship. The ocean claimed the body, as it claimed so many. The living often watched in silence, their faces pale in the lantern light. Each burial reminded them of their own fragility, of how quickly the sea or disease could take them. Yet the work of the ship never stopped. Sails still needed hauling, ropes still needed tying. A man was gone, but the voyage continued, indifferent to grief. For some, this was the hardest truth to bear, that even death was not enough to pause the endless labor of survival. Superstition clung tightly to death at sea. Some believed that the spirits of the dead lingered, haunting the ship if not properly sent to the deep. Others whispered that too many burials angered the ocean, calling storms to claim the rest. Sailors touched charms, muttered prayers, and avoided saying the names of the dead, fearful of drawing misfortune. Religion offered some comfort, but also fear, for many believed a soul cast into the sea without proper burial rites might wander forever, restless and lost. The threat of disease weighed on the mind as heavily as it did on the body. A cough could spark suspicion. A stumble could raise whispers. Every ache or sore became a cause for fear, every groan a sign of doom. Men watched one another closely, half out of concern, half out of dread that they would be next. The strain of this fear was nearly as heavy as the sickness itself, grinding down spirits already weakened by hunger, thirst, and fatigue. For the officers, disease was a danger to discipline. Sick men meant fewer hands for work, slower progress, and greater risk in storms. Sometimes desperation led to cruelty. Men who could not rise were beaten, ordered to labor until they collapsed entirely. Others were left in their hammocks, ignored, for the ship could not afford the loss of labor to care for them. Compassion was a luxury at sea, often sacrificed for survival. For you, stepping into this world, the thought of disease is overwhelming. You may imagine that you could endure the hunger, the seasickness, even the cramped quarters. But the idea of illness with no doctor, no medicine, no escape, this is nearly unbearable. To lie in the darkness, fever burning, stomach churning, surrounded by the groans of other sufferers, with only the creak of the timbers and the slap of waves for comfort, it is enough to break the strongest will. And so, as the voyage continues, you begin to see why disease was among the greatest terrors of medieval seafaring. It was not only the storms or the pirates that claimed lives, but the invisible enemies that crept silently through the ship, striking down the strong and the weak alike. It was the knowledge that, at any moment, your body could betray you, and the sea would be your only grave. This was the reality of life at sea, a floating world of hardship, where death was always near, and disease was as much a part of the voyage as the wind in the sails. To last a day was difficult. To last a month, miraculous. To last a year, almost unimaginable. Yet men did it, because they had no choice, and because the sea, for all its cruelty, was the path to survival, trade, and sometimes glory. But for you, unaccustomed, unprepared, the thought alone may be enough to end the journey before it has even truly begun. Chapter 6. The Workload, Grueling Daily Labor. If you thought the greatest challenge of a medieval sea voyage was the cramped space, the foul food, or the sickness, you would soon discover that the true burden came not from the conditions of the ship, but from the endless labor required to keep it afloat. A medieval ship was a fragile thing, a wooden body resting on the mercy of the waves. It demanded constant care, constant work, and constant attention. Every man aboard, whether seasoned sailor or inexperienced passenger, was expected to contribute. At sea, idleness was dangerous, and laziness could be deadly. From the moment the sun rose until long after it set, The ship was alive with activity. Sailors rose before dawn, roused by shouted orders or the ringing of a ship's bell. There was no gentle waking, no time to stretch and prepare. A man stumbled from his hammock or rolled off the deck where he had slept, and within moments he was at his post. The sea did not wait for a man to gather his strength, and neither did the captain. The first tasks were always the sails and the rigging. The wind was the lifeblood of the voyage, and the sails its lungs. They had to be raised, trimmed, or lowered depending on the weather, and this meant climbing the masts, balancing high above the deck as the ship rocked beneath. One slip, one missed grip, and a man could fall to his death, the wooden planks below offering no mercy. Below deck, others checked the cargo, securing barrels and crates so they would not roll with the ship's motion. Water seeped in constantly through the seams, and men were sent with buckets to bail it out, hour after hour, day after day. A carpenter inspected the hull for leaks, hammering wedges into cracks, smearing tar where the wood strained against the pressure of the sea. Even the smallest leak could grow into a disaster if ignored. Cleaning was another endless chore. The deck had to be scrubbed each day with sand and seawater to keep it from growing slick with grime. Ropes had to be coiled neatly, sails patched, tools oiled, and weapons maintained in case of pirate attack. There was never a moment when something did not require mending, tying, or hauling. A medieval ship was like a living beast, and its crew were its caretakers, always tending to its endless needs. For the body, this labor was brutal. The ropes burned your hands, leaving blisters and calluses. The constant bending and hauling bent your back, tightening muscles until they ached with each breath. Shoulders throbbed from the strain of pulling heavy sails against the wind. Knees and ankles swelled from endless climbing and crouching. There were no soft surfaces, no relief, only the unyielding wood of the deck and the sharp bite of rope. A man worked until he collapsed, and then he worked again. Meals did not offer rest. They were brief pauses, quickly consumed, often while standing or even working. The salted meat and hardtack offered little comfort, and the foul water or ale barely quenched thirst. Once the bowl was empty, a man was sent back to his post, his hunger still gnawing, his body still weary. Rest was a luxury granted only in short bursts, when the watch changed and another group took over the labor. Even then, sleep was rarely deep. A man might have a few hours in a hammock, only to be roused by shouted orders or sudden storms. The rhythm of rest was broken, always uncertain, leaving the body in a constant haze of exhaustion. The captain and officers ruled with harsh authority. Orders were given sharply, and disobedience was met with punishment. A man who was slow, who shirked his duties, or who spoke back, risked the lash of the whip. Flogging was common, the sharp crack echoing across the deck as the crew looked on. It was a brutal reminder that survival at sea left no room for weakness or rebellion. Even minor mistakes could bring severe consequences, for the safety of the ship depended on strict order. The sea never slept, and neither did the ship. Watches were kept through the darkness, men assigned to keep the sails trimmed, the wheel steady, and the lookout sharp. Torches flickered against the wind, shadows danced across the deck, and the groan of the timbers reminded all aboard that danger was constant. The men who stood watch shivered in the cold, their eyes heavy, their hands numb, while below, others tried to sleep in the stifling air, knowing they would be called to labor again before long. The storms tested this routine to its breaking point. When black clouds rolled in and the wind howled, the entire crew was roused, no matter the hour. Men scrambled across the deck, their bodies soaked in rain and spray, their voices drowned by the roar of thunder and waves. The sails had to be furled before they tore, ropes had to be tied fast, and the ship had to be kept steady against the fury of the sea. Hours passed in chaos, muscles straining, eyes stinging. When the storm passed, the men collapsed where they stood, too weary to move, But the work still went on, damaged rigging repaired, water bailed, and order restored. Even calm days demanded labor. The sea might stretch smooth and quiet to the horizon, but the ship remained needy. Sails had to be adjusted to catch the faintest breeze, decks scrubbed, supplies checked, weapons cleaned, and food rationed. There was no such thing as leisure aboard. Even moments of song or storytelling were brief, squeezed between tasks, quickly silenced when orders came. For passengers, the burden was less, but never absent. Even those who paid for passage were expected to assist in some way, whether feeding animals, bailing water, or simply moving cargo. Laziness bred resentment among the crew, and passengers who refused to contribute found themselves scorned, mocked, or even punished. At sea, everyone was part of the effort to survive, no matter their station. The physical toll of this labor was immense, but the mental toll was perhaps even greater. The endless repetition wore down the spirit. Day after day, the same ropes to haul, the same sails to trim, the same buckets to bail. There was no progress to be seen, only the endless horizon, unchanged and unchanging. A man's mind grew numb with monotony, even as his body screamed with exhaustion. For many, this was the hardest part of all, the sense that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they suffered, the sea remained the same, vast and indifferent. And yet, the work could not stop. To stop was to risk death. Every sailor knew that their labor was the only thing standing between survival and disaster. So they pushed themselves beyond what seemed possible, their bodies driven by discipline, fear, and the faint hope of reaching land. For you, unused to such toil, even a single day would be unbearable. The ropes would tear your hands, the labor would bend your back, the exhaustion would break your spirit. The sharp voice of the captain, the crack of the whip, the endless tasks with no relief, you would find yourself longing for rest, for escape, for the simple freedom of standing still. But there was no escape at sea. The only choice was to endure or to perish. This was the truth of life aboard a medieval ship, not the romance of sails and songs, but the ceaseless grind of labor. A world where every man was a worker, every hour was filled, and every moment was claimed by the demands of the vessel. And as the voyage wore on, this labor would not grow easier. It would only grow heavier, as bodies weakened, supplies dwindled, and dangers multiplied. For those unprepared, for someone like you, it would be enough to end the journey long before its destination. Chapter 7. Weathering the storms. There is a saying among old sailors that the sea is never to be trusted. On one day, it lies calm, glassy, and bright beneath the sun, as though it means to cradle the ship gently across its surface. On the next, it rages with a fury that feels almost alive, hurling waves higher than houses, and tearing its sails as if it wishes to drag the vessel into its depths. For those who lived and died on medieval ships, storms were not just part of the voyage, they were moments when life hung by the thinnest of threads. The first sign of a storm was often the sky. Clouds thickened on the horizon, darkening like a bruise across the heavens. The wind shifted suddenly, its whistle turning sharp, carrying with it the scent of rain and salt. Experienced sailors knew these warnings well. They muttered to one another, their eyes narrowing, and hurried to prepare the ship. Orders rang out. Sails were lowered or reefed to make them smaller, ropes were tightened, and cargo was secured. Passengers, bewildered, watched as the calmness of the crew gave way to tense urgency. Then the storm arrived. A sea, once rolling gently, turned violent. Waves slammed against the hull, lifting the ship high into the air before dropping it into deep troughs with bone-shaking force. The deck tilted wildly, throwing men against railings and barrels, while water poured across the planks in rushing streams. The sails snapped like thunderclaps, their canvas straining against the wind, ropes groaning as though they would tear apart. The ship itself creaked and shuddered, every timber moaning, under the weight of the sea's assault. For the crew, the work in such moments was frantic. Men scrambled up the rigging, their bodies clinging to ropes slick with rain, swaying high above the deck as the mast rocked like a tree in a storm. One misstep meant death, yet they climbed anyway, hauling sails in before they could rip to shreds. On deck, others worked the pumps, frantically bailing water that flooded in faster than it could be thrown out. Buckets passed hand to hand, the men's bodies drenched, their voices hoarse from shouting against the roar of wind and waves. Passengers had no such tasks to occupy them. They huddled where they could, gripping beams or railings, praying aloud or weeping in terror. The noise was overwhelming, the crash of waves, the groan of wood, the constant booming of thunder. Lightning split the sky, its blinding flash followed by the shuddering roll of sound that shook the chest as much as the ears. In those moments, the ship felt like the most fragile thing in the world, a toy tossed upon the ocean, always one wave away from destruction. Fear gnawed at every heart. Even the sailors, hardened by years at sea, felt it, though they masked it with curses and shouts. They knew how many ships had been claimed by storms, how many friends had been lost to the depths. A single snapped rope, a torn sail, a broken mast all could spell the end. And if the hull split or the rudder broke, the sea would pour in with merciless force. In the darkness of night, storms were worse still. Without the light of day, the sea was invisible, only felt through the violent heaving of the deck and heard through the relentless crashing. Lanterns swung wildly, their light flickering across the terrified faces of the crew. The blackness beyond the railing seemed endless, and every tilt of the ship felt like the beginning of a plunge into the abyss. Sometimes the storms lasted only hours, leaving the men exhausted but alive. Other times they dragged on for days. Food was nearly impossible to prepare, so men gnawed on hardtack between tasks, their hands still hauling ropes as they chewed. Sleep was a fantasy, stolen only in brief moments when exhaustion forced the body to collapse. Clothes never dried, skin grew raw from salt and wetness, and every muscle ached from unending work. When storms finally passed, the ship was left battered. Sails hung in tatters, ropes snapped, barrels smashed against the deck. Men collapsed where they stood, too weary to speak, their bodies shaking from fatigue. And yet there was no true rest. Repairs began at once, masts splinted, sails patched, ropes replaced. Survival demanded that the ship be made seaworthy again, for the next storm might be waiting just beyond the horizon. For those unaccustomed to such hardship, a single storm could break the spirit completely. The terror of feeling the ship lifted high on a wave only to crash down again. The helplessness of clinging to wood while the ocean roared its fury. The knowledge that at any moment the sea could swallow everything. These were enough to drive many to despair. Some whispered prayers, some swore never to sail again, and some stared silently into the distance, their minds dulled by fear. Yet storms were not always seen as chance or nature alone. For medieval sailors, they were often believed to be punishments or omens. Some said storms were sent by God to test their faith. Others blamed them on curses, on unlucky words spoken aboard, or on the presence of a woman, long thought to anger the sea. Superstitions abounded. Whistling on deck might call the wind. Killing a seabird could bring disaster. And naming certain animals or saints was thought to invite misfortune. In the heart of a storm, men clutched talismans, kissed crucifixes, or muttered spells taught to them by older sailors. Anything that might offer protection was seized upon in desperation. And still, despite all prayers and charms, many ships did not survive. The chronicles of the Middle Ages are filled with stories of vessels dashed upon rocks, of fleets scattered and lost, of men clinging to wreckage until the sea swallowed them. Survivors' tales, when they were told, spoke of days adrift, of thirst and hunger, of watching companions slip beneath the waves. These stories haunted sailors, for every storm reminded them that the same fate might be theirs. For you, to live through even one such storm would be unthinkable. The noise, the chaos, the constant fear, it would unravel you within hours. Your hands, untrained, could not grip the ropes. Your arms would falter under the strain. Your balance would betray you as the deck tilted. The sea would throw you down, again and again, until you are soaked, bruised, and broken. And all the while, your heart would pound with the knowledge that death was only a wave away. Yet this was the life of the medieval sailor. Storms are not rare, they were inevitable. To sail was to risk them, to live always with the shadow of their approach. And though they broke men, though they swallowed ships whole, sailors returned to the sea again and again, for it was their livelihood, their calling, and sometimes their only means of survival. But for you, standing trembling on the deck, clutching the railing as the ocean hurls itself at the fragile vessel, the truth is clear. You would not last a day, not with the sea rising in fury, not with the storm raging in your ears. One day in such chaos would be enough to send you begging for land, for silence, for safety. And yet, the voyage must continue, through calm and storm alike, for the sea does not care for your fear. It only demands your endurance. Chapter 8. Navigation and the Fear of the Unknown. For all the labor, hardship, and storms, perhaps the most unsettling part of a medieval voyage was the sheer uncertainty of direction. On land, a man could look at the road beneath his feet and know where it led. Villages, churches, and rivers marked the way. But on the open sea, there were no roads, no signs, no familiar markers. The world stretched out in endless blue, the horizon unbroken in every direction. A medieval sailor lived with the constant awareness that he could be lost at any moment, and often he was. Navigation in the Middle Ages was far from the science it would later become. Compasses existed by the 13th century in Europe, but they were still rare, expensive, and not always trusted. Many captains relied instead on older methods passed down through generations. They studied the stars, memorized the paths of the sun and moon, and learned to read the patterns of the wind and waves. Yet the stars could vanish behind clouds for days. The sun could be hidden by storms, and the waves themselves were never certain. Even the most experienced sailor sometimes guessed more than he knew. Landmarks were precious. Coastal voyages were the safest, for sailors could keep the shoreline in sight, following its curves and features like a guide. But when ships struck out into deeper waters, when land slipped beyond the horizon, they entered a realm of guesswork and faith. Charts were crude at best, hand-drawn with little accuracy, filled more with imagination than reality. Distances were estimated by dead reckoning measuring speed, direction, and time, but a miscalculation of even a few miles a day added up to disaster after weeks at sea. The fear of the unknown haunted these journeys. Stories spread among sailors of seas without end, where ships wandered until supplies ran out and the crew starved. Tales of islands that appeared on maps but vanished in reality, of monsters lurking just beyond sight, filled men's minds as they stared across the horizon. The ocean was not just a body of water, it was a vast, living mystery, full of dangers no man could predict. Night navigation brought its own terrors. By day, at least the sun offered direction. At night, under clear skies, sailors sought the North Star, steady in its position, a beacon of orientation. But when clouds rolled in, the world became a void. The sea and sky blurred into one, the horizon erased, the ship adrift in blackness. The sound of waves crashing in the dark was all that guided them, and more often than not, it felt as though they were drifting aimlessly into nothing. Mist and fog could be worse than storms. At least storms announced themselves with thunder and wind. Fog crept in silently, swallowing sight until a man could not see the end of the deck. The ship might be only miles from shore, but no one could tell. Rocks loomed suddenly, invisible until too late. Many ships met their end this way, dashed against unseen coasts while their crews stood helpless. The fog was a thief, stealing vision, confidence, and lives. For passengers, the uncertainty was unbearable. A man paying for passage might ask the captain how long until land, only to receive a shrug or a vague answer. Soon, if the winds hold, or God willing, within a fortnight. Days stretched endlessly, with no landmarks to count, no progress to measure. The ocean gave no sign that the ship moved at all. Whether they were nearing their destination or drifting hopelessly in circles, no one could say with certainty. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge failed. Some believed that strange lights on the horizon were omens, spirits guiding or deceiving. Others swore that certain birds, seen flying overhead, promised land nearby. There were whispers of the edge of the world, a place where the sea simply ended, where ships fell into nothingness. Though learned men dismissed such tales, fear clung tightly in the minds of sailors, especially when the days dragged on without sight of land. The ocean itself seemed to conspire in mystery. Strange currents pulled ships off course, sweeping them silently away from their intended path. Winds shifted suddenly, carrying vessels into unknown waters. A journey planned for weeks might stretch into months, provisions dwindling as confusion grew. Every man aboard felt the weight of not knowing where they were or where they were going. It was a fear deeper than storms or sickness, the fear of being lost, of drifting forever, forgotten by the world. Captains bore the heaviest burden. Their authority depended on confidence, yet often their certainty was little more than hope. They studied their crude charts, paced the deck at night, muttered prayers as they checked the stars. To admit ignorance was dangerous, for it could spark panic or mutiny. So they gave orders with firm voices, even when doubt gnawed at their hearts. The crew followed, pretending faith, but whispers spread quickly in the darkness. Men asked one another if the captain truly knew the way, if perhaps they had already strayed too far, if perhaps they would never see land again. The silence of the sea added to the unease. On land, one could hear birds, dogs, voices, the sounds of life. At sea, there was only the groan of the ship and the endless wash of waves. In that monotony, the mind wandered. Some thought of home, their hearts heavy with longing. Others dreamed of distant lands, of riches or salvation. But all felt the press of uncertainty, the constant reminder that the ocean was far larger than human understanding, and they were but a speck upon it. When land did appear after weeks or months, the sight was overwhelming. A cry from the lookout, the faint outline of a coast in the distance, brought shouts of joy and tears to men's eyes. Yet even then, fear lingered. Was it the right land? Would it offer safety? Or would it bring danger in the form of hostile people, rocky shores, or strange diseases? The unknown never ended. It only shifted. For you to stand on the deck of a medieval ship and realize that no one truly knew where they were would be a terror unlike any other. You are used to maps that show every coast, compasses that point true north, engines that follow precise courses. But in the Middle Ages, the sea was a vast riddle, and every voyage was a gamble. To sail was to place your life in the hands of wind, stars, and hope. Even the bravest hearts quailed at the thought of drifting endlessly, lost upon an ocean without mercy. And so, navigation was not simply a matter of charts and stars. It was a constant battle against fear, against ignorance, against the mysteries of the world. For the medieval sailor, the sea was not conquered but endured, each voyage a fragile thread stretched between departure and arrival, always threatening to snap. For someone like you, unused to uncertainty, the very thought of sailing blind across endless water would be enough to end the journey before it began. Chapter 9. encounters with pirates. If storms were the fury of nature, then pirates were the fury of men. For medieval sailors, the sea was not only dangerous because of its waves and winds, it was dangerous because of the people who prowled upon it, searching for prey. Pirates were the nightmares of the ocean, feared more than storms, more than disease, for they brought not only death, but cruelty, captivity, and humiliation. A voyage might begin in peace, the ship sailing steadily across calm waters. But always, there lingered the fear that on the horizon a sail might appear. The lookout at the mast's peak kept his eyes sharp, scanning the endless expanse. For ships were rare in some waters, and any sudden appearance was cause for alarm. At first, it might seem harmless, a small shape white against the blue. But as it drew nearer, and its course was fixed upon your own, dread would spread through the crew. Sailors knew the signs of a predator. A ship that followed too closely, that gained speed with unnatural persistence, that angled directly for the bow or stern. These were hunters, and you were the hunted. Medieval pirates were not the romantic figures of storybooks, with bright flags and charming bravado. They were desperate men, brutal men, often ex-sailors themselves, who had turned to raiding when honest work failed them. They came in fast ships, light and nimble, built for speed. Their crews were hardened by lawlessness, ready to fight, eager for plunder. Some flew no flag at all. Others displayed false banners to deceive their victims until the last moment. By the time you realized their intent, it was often too late. When pirates approached, panic gripped the ship. The captain might order the crew to flee, sails stretched to their limit as the vessel strained for speed. But merchant ships, weighed down with cargo, were rarely faster than the raiders. Soon the gap closed, and the cries of the pursuers carried across the waves. Their shouts were fierce, promising death or slavery, their weapons gleaming in the sun. The hunted ship rocked with desperation, every man praying for a wind to rise, for a miracle to carry them away. If escape failed, battle began. Weapons were hauled out, rusted swords, axes, spears, perhaps a crossbow if the ship was well supplied. The sailors, weary from labor, now faced combat, untrained in the arts of war, but driven by the instinct to survive. The pirates, by contrast, were swift and merciless. Grappling hooks flew across the gap, biting into the railings. Ropes were pulled tight, and soon the two ships were lashed together, wood against wood. The pirates swarming across like wolves leaping into a pen. The fight was brutal, close, and desperate. Men screamed, steel clashed, and the deck became a chaos of violence. Blood mixed with seawater as the waves washed across the planks. For many, there was no chance of resistance. A sailor armed with a knife was no match for a hardened pirate swinging an axe. Within minutes, the battle often ended, the defending crew cut down, subdued, or thrown into submission. And then came the plunder. Pirates stripped the ship of everything of value: cargo, coins, tools, even clothing. Barrels of food and water were carried off, weapons seized, and anything portable taken as spoils. The defeated sailors were left with nothing but rags, their voyage ruined. Sometimes the pirates killed them outright, tossing bodies into the sea as casually as one might discard scraps. Other times they took prisoners, chaining them in the holds of their own ships. These captives faced grim futures, sold into slavery, held for ransom, or forced to labor as pirates themselves. The cruelty of pirates was well known. Some tortured their victims to reveal hidden goods, using knives, ropes, or fire to break their will. Others amused themselves with humiliation, mocking, beating, or disfiguring those they captured. For medieval sailors, the fear of pirates was not only fear of death, but fear of what might be suffered before death came. Tales of such horrors spread quickly in ports, whispered in taverns and markets, feeding the terror of every voyage. There were places more dangerous than others. Narrow straits, busy trade routes, and waters near lawless coasts were hunting grounds for raiders. The Mediterranean, for example, swarmed with corsairs, while the northern seas knew their share of Norse raiders and outlaws. To pass through such waters was to travel with one's heart in one's throat, eyes fixed on the horizon, ears straining for the sound of sails snapping in pursuit. Superstition clung to piracy as it did to storms. Some sailors swore they could smell pirates before seeing them, a sharp tongue on the wind that warned of blood. Others believed that unlucky words spoken aboard, or failure to offer prayers at departure, invited raiders as punishment. Amulets were worn, charms hung from masts, prayers muttered beneath the breath, all in the hope that pirates would pass them by. The presence of pirates also changed how ships traveled. Some sailed in convoys, clustering together in hopes of safety in numbers. Others hired guards or men-at-arms, though these were expensive and not always effective. Still, the fear persisted, for no defense was certain, and every voyage risked an encounter. The ocean was too vast, and law too weak, to offer protection. For passengers, the terror was perhaps the worst. Unlike sailors, they had no weapons, no training, no hope of resisting. They huddled below deck, listening to the clash above, praying that they would not be found. But pirates always searched thoroughly, dragging out the hidden, tearing away any valuables they carried. Gold rings, necklaces, even boots or belts, nothing escaped the greed of raiders. And when they chose to take captives, it was often the passengers who were dragged away first, their cries echoing long after the ships parted. The aftermath of a pirate attack was grim. The decks stained with blood, the sails torn, the cargo gone, and the crew broken in body and spirit. Survivors stared silently at the horizon, their eyes hollow, knowing that all their labor had been for nothing. Weeks, perhaps months, of hardship had been wiped away in minutes. The voyage might continue, but it was now a march of misery, the destination uncertain, the rewards gone. For you, the thought of pirates would shatter any sense of endurance. To stand on deck, watching as a dark ship closed in, sails billowing, men shouting, weapons raised, it would freeze your blood. To hear the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the laughter of men who lived by cruelty, it would break your courage. Even if you survived, stripped of possessions, bruised and bloodied, the memory would haunt you forever. This, too, was part of medieval sea travel. Not only storms, not only sickness, but the ever-present risk of violence from other men. The sea was not empty. It was crowded with hunters and prey, and more often than not, a ship carrying goods or passengers was prey. Survival meant not only enduring the hardships of nature, but escaping the cruelty of mankind. And so, as the voyage continues in your imagination, you add yet another fear to the list. The sea offers no mercy, but neither do the men who sail upon it. To last even a single day in such a world is a feat of endurance. To last a voyage, to return home alive, is nothing short of miraculous. Chapter 10. Hierarchy on board, sailors, officers, and authority. A medieval ship was not only a vessel upon the sea, it was a society afloat, with its own laws, customs, and order. Just as a village on land had its lord and peasants, its rules and its punishments, so too did a ship at sea. In such a confined and perilous world, hierarchy was not a suggestion, but a necessity. Without clear authority, discipline, and structure, chaos would consume the voyage, and the sea would claim yet another vessel. At the very top of this order stood the captain. His word was law, his authority absolute, for the safety of the ship depended upon it. A captain was often chosen for his experience, his skill in navigation, and his reputation for strength. He was not always a gentle man, nor even a just one, but he had to command obedience. So the captain's voice carried above all others, and when he gave an order, every man moved without question. Beneath him were the officers' mates, masters, and sometimes a pilot. These men acted as his eyes and hands, ensuring his commands were carried out, directing the crew in their labor, and maintaining the rhythm of life aboard. They oversaw the rigging, the sails, the steering, and the watches. The pilot, if one was present, was prized above all, for he held the knowledge of coastlines, currents, and stars. His wisdom could mean the difference between safe arrival and shipwreck on hidden reefs. The sailors formed the heart of the crew. Rough men, hardened by years of toil, they hauled the ropes, scrubbed the decks, mended the sails, and baled the water. They were the laborers of the sea, the ones whose muscles kept the ship alive. Their pay was small, their rations meager, and their lives filled with hardship, yet without them, no voyage could succeed. They endured the lash of the whip, the scorn of officers, and the endless grind of work, for the sea offered little else in the way of livelihood. At the bottom of the order were the boys and the lowest hands cabin boys, apprentices, and servants. These were often young, some no more than 12, sent to sea to learn the trade or simply because their families had no other way to feed them. They ran errands, carried messages, fetched food and drink, and bore the brunt of cruelty from the older men. Their lives were harsh, filled with blows, insults, and the most menial of tasks. Yet for many, this was the beginning of a lifelong existence upon the water. For once the sea claimed a boy, it rarely let him go. Passengers occupied a strange place within this hierarchy. Wealthy travelers might command respect, their status and payment affording them a measure of privilege. They ate better, slept in slightly cleaner quarters, and were spared from the hardest labor. But in moments of crisis, their wealth meant little. The authority of the captain reigned supreme, and passengers who refused to obey could find themselves treated no better than sailors, ordered to bail water or pull ropes under threat of punishment. For poorer passengers, there was little difference from the crew. They shared the same food, the same cramped space, and the same backbreaking work. Discipline aboard ship was harsh, for it had to be. In such a confined world, with tempers short and dangers many, even a single act of rebellion could spread into mutiny. Disobedience was punished swiftly. The whip was common, its leather cords biting into flesh until the skin split. Men were tied to the mast or lashed across the deck, their screams ringing out as warnings to others. Theft was treated severely, for stealing food or water threatened the survival of all. At times, the punishment was death, a thief thrown overboard or hanged from the yardarm to remind the rest of the cost of betrayal. And yet, despite this cruelty, there was also solidarity. Sailors shared the same hardships, the same hunger, the same exhaustion. They sang together as they worked, their voices rising in rhythm to ease the strain of hauling ropes. They told stories at night, whispered superstitions, and comforted one another in fear. Bonds formed quickly, for a man's life might depend on the grip of his companion when climbing the rigging in a storm. Among the crew, there was an understanding that they were all in this together, bound by the sea and its merciless demands. The captain's authority, though absolute, was not invulnerable. Mutiny was always a danger, lurking like a storm on the horizon. If the crew felt mistreated beyond endurance, if rations dwindled too far, or if the captain's decisions led them into ruin, whispers could grow into defiance. In rare but desperate cases, sailors rose against their master, seizing control of the ship. Such acts were perilous, for mutiny often led to chaos, and chaos at sea often meant death. Yet the fear of it kept captains wary, reminding them that even absolute power required careful balance. Religion and ritual also played a role in authority. Before setting sail, blessings might be sought, prayers offered to God for safe passage. Crosses were carved into beams, relics carried aboard, and services held when possible. The captain often led these prayers or ordered them to be given, reinforcing his role not only as leader but as guardian of the crew's souls. Faith offered order when reason faltered, binding men together beneath a shared hope of divine protection. But it was the rhythm of work songs that carried men through their labor. Chanted lines and repeated verses kept the ropes moving, the sails rising, the buckets lifting. These songs created unity, each voice part of the whole, each man bound to the others in effort. They were not songs of joy, but of endurance, carrying men through the long hours of toil. For you, the strictness of this hierarchy would be difficult to bear. To be ordered about, shouted at, punished without question, it would grate against your sense of freedom. Yet aboard a medieval ship, freedom did not exist. There was only duty, discipline, and the chain of command. To disobey was to endanger not only yourself, but everyone aboard. The ship was a fragile world, and its survival depended on every man knowing his place and fulfilling it without hesitation. And so, life aboard was not only hardship of body, but hardship of spirit. The sea demanded obedience, demanded unity, demanded that men surrender themselves to the order of the ship. To last even a day required not only strength but submission, the acceptance that your life was not your own, but part of the greater whole. For those unwilling to bend, the sea was merciless, and the lash or the deep awaited them. This was the hierarchy of the medieval voyage. A floating society, strict and unforgiving, where the captain's word was law. The officers enforced it, the sailors endured it, and the passengers submitted to it. Without such order, no ship could survive. And for you, unaccustomed to such discipline, the weight of this authority would be as heavy as the waves themselves. Another reason why you would not last a single day upon the medieval sea. Chapter 11. The role of animals on board. A medieval ship was not only filled with sailors, officers, and passengers. It was also home to a surprising variety of animals, both welcome and unwelcome. Some were brought intentionally, as food, companions, or workers. Others came uninvited, creeping aboard in the dark, thriving in the damp corners and hidden spaces of the vessel. Together, they created a strange floating menagerie, one that added to the noise, the smell, and the daily reality of life at sea. The most obvious of these were the livestock. Before refrigeration, there was no way to preserve fresh meat for long voyages, so animals were carried aboard to be slaughtered when needed. Chickens clucked and fluttered in cages, their feathers scattering across the deck, their eggs collected when the voyage was still early. Pigs squealed in pens, their sharp cries piercing even the roar of the waves. Sometimes sheep or goats were brought as well, their bleating filling the air, their wool and milk put to use before they were eaten. In rare cases, larger animals, horses or oxen, were transported for trade or war, their nervous stamping adding to the chaos of the deck. These animals provided food, but they also created constant work. They had to be fed and watered, even when supplies were scarce. Their waste had to be cleaned, though, in truth, much of it simply mixed with the filth already coating the deck. The smell was powerful, a mixture of manure, feathers, and sweat that mingled with the tar and salt of the ship itself. For sailors, it became a background odor, barely noticed after a time, but for newcomers, it was overwhelming. Dogs were also common aboard ships. Some were working animals, trained to guard cargo or help manage livestock. Others were companions, their presence a comfort to sailors who spent months away from home. A dog's bark echoed across the deck when strangers approached, its wagging tail a rare reminder of warmth and loyalty. But even dogs were not spared the hardships of the voyage. They too went hungry when rations ran low, and many did not survive long journeys. Cats, however, were perhaps the most valued companions of all. They were not brought for affection, though many sailors grew fond of them, but for necessity. Cats were the guardians against rats and mice, which infested every corner of the ship. Without cats, these vermin would devour the precious stores of grain and gnaw through ropes, weakening the very fabric of the vessel. A good ship's cat could mean the difference between survival and disaster. They prowled the holds at night, their eyes gleaming in the lantern light, their movements silent and sure. Sailors sometimes treated them with superstitious reverence, believing a cat's presence brought luck, while harming one could bring ruin. But no matter how many cats lived aboard, the rats were never fully gone. They multiplied in the dark, feeding on crumbs, spoiled meat, and even the dead. Their scratching was heard in the night, their scurrying felt along beams and hammocks. They crept across sleeping bodies, nibbled at the hardtack, and spread fleas that carried disease. Sailors hated them, but they were inescapable. To live at sea was to live among rats, sharing the ship with countless unwanted passengers. Lice and fleas were another unavoidable plague. They infested clothing, bedding, and hair, biting constantly, leaving men scratching until their skin was raw. There was no relief, no true washing at sea, only brief rinses with salt water that did little to cleanse. The itch was constant, the crawling sensation maddening. Some sailors joked about their companions, naming the larger lice as if they were pets, but the humor was bitter. These tiny creatures were as much a part of shipboard life as ropes and sails. Birds, too, played a role. Not only the chickens in cages, but wild seabirds that circled overhead, their cries echoing across the waves. For sailors, the sight of certain birds brought hope, for they were signs of land nearby. Gulls, terns, and cormorants were watched closely, their flight paths studied as eagerly as the stars. To see a flock wheeling in the sky was to feel a spark of relief, proof that the endless sea might soon give way to shore. Fish, though not kept aboard, were caught whenever possible. Lines were cast over the side, nets lowered into the deep, and the occasional splash of a captured fish brought cheer to the weary crew. These moments were celebrated, for they broke the monotony of salted meat and hardtack. Yet fishing was uncertain, and often the sea yielded nothing, leaving the men hungry and disappointed. Together, all these animals shaped the daily atmosphere of the voyage. The ship was not only a machine of wood and rope, but a living ark of creatures, each with its own sounds and smells. The cluck of hens, the squeal of pigs, the bark of dogs, the purr of cats, the scratching of rats, all blended into a constant chorus, layered over the creak of timbers and the crash of waves. To sleep was to hear it, to wake was to smell it, to live was to share your space with beasts both friend and foe. Superstitions grew around these animals as well. Cats, as mentioned, were considered lucky, but black cats in particular were often seen as especially powerful. Dogs were thought to sense danger before men did, barking at storms or warning of ill fortune. Rats abandoning a ship were seen as a dire omen, proof that the vessel itself might soon be lost. Even the cries of seabirds could inspire fear or hope, depending on their timing and direction. For the unaccustomed, the presence of animals aboard was yet another shock. The lack of space was already unbearable, and to share that space with pigs and chickens, with fleas and rats, made it worse still. The smell clung to clothing, the noise rang in the ears, the crawling of vermin haunted every moment. To those hardened by the sea, it was normal, even expected. But for you, unused to such filth and closeness, it would be almost impossible to endure. And yet these animals were not merely inconveniences. They were part of survival. They provided food, they protected supplies, they offered companionship in moments of despair. Without them, voyages would have been far harsher, perhaps even impossible. They were as much a part of the ship's crew as the men themselves, sharing in the dangers, the storms, and the endless horizon. So, when you imagine a medieval voyage, do not picture only the sailors and officers. Picture the hens scratching in their cages, the pigs grunting as the deck sways, the dogs pacing restlessly, the cats prowling with silent purpose, the rats darting through shadows. Picture the lice in the seams of your clothing, the fleas in your bedding, the seabirds circling above. This was the reality of life at sea, a crowded, noisy, smelly, crawling world where man and beast alike endured together. And for someone like you, it is yet another reason why a single day aboard would be more than enough. Chapter 12. The sounds of the voyage. When you imagine the sea, perhaps you think first of the sight of it, the endless blue horizon, the rolling waves, the glimmer of sunlight on water. But for those who lived aboard medieval ships, the sound of the voyage was just as constant, just as defining, and just as difficult to endure. A ship was never silent. It was a world filled with noise, both natural and human, from the moment you awoke to the moment you tried to sleep. The first sound that greeted you each day was the groaning of the timbers. The ship was alive with movement, its wooden frame straining against the waves, the beams creaking and flexing as though the vessel itself breathed. Every roll of the sea made the hull complain, deep moans rising from beneath your feet, sharp cracks echoing from above. At first, these sounds filled newcomers with unease. Was the ship breaking apart? Would the wood hold? But for seasoned sailors, the creak and groan became background music, always present, never absent. Above, the sails snapped in the wind. Canvas stretched tight, then loosened, then snapped again with the sudden shifts of air. The ropes that bound them thrummed and whistled, vibrating under the strain. When the wind was strong, the sound was constant like thunder rolling across the sky. When it died, the sails flapped weakly, like the wings of a dying bird, until they hung limp in silence. In either case, the sound of the sails reminded everyone that the ship as life depended upon the invisible force of the wind. The sea itself was a voice without end. Waves slapped against the hull in an endless rhythm, sometimes gentle, like a lullaby, sometimes violent, like the pounding of drums. In storms, the sea roared, a deafening crash that drowned out every other sound. Men shouted until their throats were raw, but their voices vanished in the tumult. Even in calm, the water was never truly quiet. It hissed, it splashed, it whispered beneath the ship, carrying messages only the ocean could understand. Then there were the sounds of labor, the grunts of men hauling ropes in unison, their voices chanting work songs to keep rhythm. The scrape of sand and brushes on the deck as it was scrubbed clean. The hammering of the carpenter repairing beams. The clatter of tools, the ring of nails driven into wood. Buckets sloshed with water. Chains rattled, barrels thudded as they were rolled into place. Every task created its own music, blending into the constant chorus of shipboard life. Animals added to the noise. Chickens clucked and flapped, pigs squealed, goats bleated, and dogs barked at shadows. Cats meowed from the corners, demanding scraps or announcing their hunts. At night, rats scurried in the beams, their claws scratching, their squeaks sharp and unsettling. Fleas and lice made no sound, but the constant scratching of men trying to relieve the itch added its own rhythm. Together, these sounds made the ship feel less like a vessel of men and more like a floating farmyard, every creature adding its voice to the chaos. Voices filled every gap. Orders barked by the captain or mates rang sharp and firm, cutting across the noise of the sea. Sailors shouted to one another from mast to deck, their words carried away by the wind so that they had to yell louder, harsher, more urgently. Arguments broke out in the cramped quarters, curses thrown in frustration, laughter rising in brief moments of relief. Songs, too, were common. Not songs of leisure, but work songs chants repeated in rhythm to keep ropes moving and sails rising. Their melodies were rough, their verses simple, but their purpose was clear, to keep men united in effort, to drown fatigue in the strength of many voices combined. At night, the soundscape shifted, but never faded. The sea grew louder in the darkness, its unseen waves crashing against the hull with greater menace. The timbers creaked more sharply, each groan echoing in the hollow spaces below deck. The whisper of the wind seemed stronger, whistling through the rigging, rattling the ropes. In the hammocks, men snored, coughed, muttered in sleep, their rest broken by discomfort. Rats scurried boldly now, emboldened by darkness, their claws clicking across wood. Lanterns swung with a faint creak, chains clinking softly as they swayed. Sleep was never silent. Even in calm seas, noise intruded from every side. The ship moved, the sea spoke, men shifted and muttered. Silence belonged to land. At sea, the world was alive with sound, and a man learned either to endure it or to lose his mind. Superstition clung to sounds as it did to everything else aboard. A sudden silence in the wind was feared, for it meant dead calm. A ship trapped and unmoving in the middle of the ocean. Strange noises in the hull were taken as omens, the sea whispering warnings of disaster. The cries of seabirds were read as messages sometimes of land near, sometimes of storms coming. Even the groaning of the timbers was given meaning, as though the ship itself were speaking to its crew, complaining of their burdens or warning of danger ahead. For you, unaccustomed to such a world, the noise would be overwhelming. On land, you know the quiet of night, the peace of silence broken only by familiar sounds. At sea, there is no such comfort. Every moment is filled with creaking, crashing, shouting, and scratching. The noise seeps into your dreams, startles you awake, follows you into every corner of the vessel. There is no escape, no silence, no peace. And yet, for sailors, the sounds became part of their being. They could tell the health of the ship by the groan of its timbers, the strength of the wind by the snap of its sails, the mood of their fellows by the tone of their songs. To them, the voyage was not only seen, but heard, a symphony of wood, water, wind, and voice. For you, it would be unbearable. For them, it was life itself. And so, when you imagine the medieval voyage, remember not only the sights, the smells, the hardships. Remember the endless noise, the living heartbeat of a ship upon the sea, a chorus of survival that never ceased until land was reached, or the ocean claimed them forever. Chapter 13. Mental toll, isolation, and loneliness. Life aboard a medieval ship did not only test the body, it tested the mind in ways that were often harder to endure than the labor or the sickness. A voyage meant weeks, sometimes months, adrift upon the sea, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. For men used to the variety of land, the bustle of villages, the changing of seasons, the closeness of family, the monotony of the ocean pressed heavily upon the spirit. Each day seemed the same deck beneath your feet, the same sails above your head, the same horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sun rose, climbed, and sank, and the moon followed, but beyond that there was little sense of time. A week felt like a day felt like a year. The rhythm of watches and meals gave some structure, but it was a narrow rhythm, a drumbeat without melody, a cycle without end. Many men found themselves staring blankly across the waves, their minds wandering into silence, dulled by repetition. Isolation was perhaps the greatest weight. Once land vanished from sight, you were cut off from the world you knew. There were no letters, no messengers, no news from home. Whatever joy or sorrow happened on shore, you would not hear of it until you returned, if you returned at all. A man might sail away, leaving his child an infant, and come back to find him grown. He might kiss his wife goodbye, and never know that she wept for him each night, never knowing if he still lived. The sea was a wall between you and the life you left behind, and for many, the loneliness of that wall was unbearable. Even surrounded by men, loneliness persisted. The company was constant too constant. Privacy did not exist. You slept, ate, and worked beside the same faces every hour of every day. But closeness is not the same as connection. Arguments flared easily in the cramped quarters, and tempers wore thin. A sharp word, a careless shove, a stolen ration, These small sparks could light fires of anger that smoldered for days. In such a world, companionship was strained, and trust was fragile. Yet bonds did form. Men sang together at their labor, told stories in the dim light below deck, and shared dreams of land and home. These bonds were necessary, for without them, despair might crush the spirit entirely. But even friendship could not erase the deeper loneliness, the longing for family, for home, for the freedom to walk on grass or breathe the scent of fields. No companionship aboard a ship could replace the comfort of land. Superstition and faith became refuges for the mind. Men clung to charms, muttered prayers, or told tales of omens and portents. Belief gave shape to the shapeless, turned fear into ritual. A sailor might whisper to the sea, as though it were a living being, bargaining for safety. Another might carve a cross into the mast, believing it would protect them from storms. These acts soothed the mind, even if they held no power, for they gave the illusion of control in a world where so little could be controlled. The nights were hardest. In the darkness, when the sea stretched black and endless, when the wind howled or the ship creaked in eerie tones, men lay awake with their thoughts. Memories of home rose unbidden, regrets gnawed. Some wept quietly, muffling their sobs in their hammocks. Others stared at the beams above, their eyes wide, their minds filled with dread of never returning. Sleep, when it came, was broken by dreams of drowning, of storms, of loved ones calling across impossible distances. Waking brought little relief, for the sea remained, vast and indifferent. For some, the strain was too great. They fell into despair, refusing to work, withdrawing into silence. Others turned to anger, lashing out at their fellows, stirring trouble that endangered the crew. Drunkenness offered escape when ale or wine remained, but it brought fights, punishments, and greater misery. Madness was not unknown at seamen who stared too long at the horizon, who muttered to themselves, who laughed at nothing until their laughter turned to screams. In such cases, the crew feared them, pitied them, but rarely could they help. The sea had claimed their minds, just as it claimed bodies in storms. For passengers unused to the hardships of the sea, the mental toll was even sharper. A merchant might leave his bustling city, his friends and comforts, only to find himself adrift among strangers, his every day reduced to monotony and fear. A pilgrim might embark with hope and faith, only to find his spirit broken by the endless days of sameness. Without the discipline of sailors hardened to the life, many passengers suffered deeply, their minds unraveling long before the voyage was done. And yet, for all the loneliness, there were moments of wonder. A sunrise painted the sky with colors no painter could capture. A school of dolphins leapt alongside the ship, their sleek bodies gleaming in the light. Stars spread across the heavens in numbers unseen on land, vast and endless, reminding sailors of both the smallness of their lives and the greatness of creation. These moments did not erase the hardships, but they offered glimpses of beauty, fleeting comforts in an otherwise grim existence. Still, the isolation remained. Day after day, week after week, the sea reminded men that they were small, fragile, and alone. For you, unused to such solitude, the weight would be crushing. The monotony would dull your spirit, the loneliness gnaw at your heart. Even surrounded by voices, you would feel cut off, lost in a world of water with no escape. This, too, was why medieval voyages were so harsh. They were not only trials of strength and endurance, but of the mind. To survive the sea was to survive the isolation, the boredom, the longing, and the despair. Few could do so without scars upon the soul. And for you, even a single day of such emptiness might be more than you could bear. Chapter 14. Dangers of the Unknown World. To sail in the Middle Ages was to step willingly into mystery. Maps were crude sketches, often more imagination than fact, and the seas stretched far beyond what most men could comprehend. The world, to sailors, was full of dangers hidden just beyond sight, waiting to reveal themselves when least expected. Storms and pirates were threats they knew well. But there were other terrors, less predictable, that haunted every voyage reefs. Ice, fog, and diseases that came from distant lands. Together, they made the unknown world a place of constant fear. Reefs and rocks were among the deadliest of these dangers. The sea, calm on the surface, could conceal jagged stone teeth just below the waves. A ship might sail smoothly one moment, then shudder violently as its hull tore open on unseen rock. Water poured in, timbers split, men screamed, and within minutes the vessel could be lost. These hazards were worst in unfamiliar waters, near coasts poorly charted or never visited before. Sailors feared the crunch of wood against stone more than almost anything, for it often came without warning, in the dead of night or in thick fog. Fog itself was a terror. It crept silently across the water, swallowing the ship in a pale shroud. The lookout could not see the horizon. The helmsman could not see the bow. Men spoke in hushed tones, their voices dampened by the heavy air, every creak and splash amplified. In fog, the danger of reefs and coasts grew tenfold. Many ships were lost this way, dashed against unseen shores, while their crews still thought themselves far out to sea. The silence of fog, broken suddenly by the roar of waves on rocks, was a sound that lived forever in sailors' memories. Cold was another enemy. Voyages that pushed northward risked icebergs drifting like floating fortresses, unseen until too late. These frozen giants towered above the ship, their bulk hidden beneath the water, ready to rip through a hull with the force of nature itself. Even without icebergs, the cold seas chilled men to the bone, numbing hands, stiffening muscles, and sapping strength. Frostbitten fingers could not grip ropes, and hypothermia crept silently, stealing warmth until a man collapsed, never to rise again. Heat brought its own dangers. In southern waters, the sun burned without mercy, beating down upon deck and sail alike. Skin blistered, lips cracked, and thirst became unbearable. Water supplies dwindled quickly, spoiling faster in the heat, leaving men desperate. Some stripped down, trying to cool themselves in the faint breeze, while others collapsed in the shade of barrels, too weak to move. The sea, indifferent, shimmered in the distance, offering no relief but more salt. Diseases from foreign lands haunted sailors as much as those that came from within the ship. Ports brought contact with new people, new foods, new climates, and with them came illnesses for which the crew had no defense. Fevers, rashes, and plagues spread quickly, carried back aboard the vessel to infect all. What began as excitement at reaching a new harbor could turn swiftly to despair when men fell sick after leaving it. Tales spread of strange diseases contracted in distant lands, and though sailors could not name them, they feared them deeply. Beyond the tangible dangers lay those of imagination. The unknown world was filled with story sea monsters that rose from the depths to crush ships, serpents longer than masts that wrapped around vessels and dragged them under, whirlpools that sucked ships into their spinning maws. Sailors swore they had seen these creatures, their shapes glimpsed in storms or in the darkness of night. Whether real or imagined, the fear was real enough, gripping men as they stared into the black waves, wondering what might be lurking beneath. Legends of cursed waters also circulated. Certain regions were said to bring endless storms, others to drive men mad with disorientation. Ghost ships, seen through mist, were believed to be omens of doom, the souls of lost sailors forever wandering. Some spoke of islands that lured ships close with promise of land, only to vanish like mirages when approached. These tales may sound fanciful, but to men who lived with constant uncertainty, they were as believable as the stars above. The unknown world also meant the fear of never arriving. Voyages stretched on far longer than expected. Winds failed, currents carried ships astray and food supplies dwindled. Each day without sight of land deepened the dread. Perhaps they had missed their destination entirely. Perhaps they were circling endlessly in some forgotten corner of the sea. The idea of drifting until starvation claimed them haunted every crew, a silent danger that grew heavier with each passing week. For passengers, the dangers of the unknown world were even harder to bear. Sailors, hardened by experience, could at least rely on instinct and tradition. Passengers had nothing but fear. Every strange sound in the night, every shadow on the horizon, every rumor whispered by the crew seemed a sign of doom. Many prayed constantly, clutching rosaries or charms, their eyes wide with terror at the thought of monsters, storms, or shipwreck. The mind itself became an enemy. Long voyages left men imagining threats where none existed. A splash in the night might be a sea serpent, a shifting shadow, a ghostly sail. In truth, they were often nothing but fish or clouds, yet the imagination, starved of stimulation and filled with fear, gave them form. These fears could spread quickly, turning rumor into panic and panic into chaos. The unknown was not only out there, in the vast ocean. It was within the minds of those who sailed upon it. And yet, men kept sailing. Despite the reefs, the fog, the ice, the heat, the disease, the monsters, and the fear, ships left harbor again and again. Trade demanded it, faith demanded it, war demanded it. The dangers were real, but the rewards were greater. To return safely was to bring wealth, honor, or salvation. To die was always a risk, but it was a risk men learned to take, for life on land was often no kinder. For you, however, the dangers of the unknown world would be too much. To stand on deck, knowing that unseen rocks might lie beneath the waves, that fog might hide disaster, that disease might strike at any moment, that monsters might rise from the deep, it would unravel your courage. Even if none of these dangers appeared, the constant knowledge that they could appear at any time would wear down your spirit. Fear of the unknown is often worse than fear of the known, and at sea, the unknown was everywhere. This, too, was why a medieval voyage was so brutal. It was not only the hardships of labor or the pains of hunger, it was the constant shadow of dangers unseen, the endless weight of what might be waiting just beyond the horizon. Few could endure such fear for long. For someone like you, a single day would be more than enough. Chapter 15. Encounters in port, trade, and temptation. After weeks or even months at sea, the sight of land was overwhelming. A faint smudge on the horizon, a line of darker color against the endless blue, was enough to send cries of relief ringing across the deck. Men who had grown silent and dull with exhaustion suddenly shouted with joy. Passengers fell to their knees in prayer, tears streaming down their faces. Even the most hardened sailors, who had seen countless voyages, felt their hearts lift. Land meant safety, food, and rest. It meant escape, however brief, from the floating prison of the ship. Yet arriving in port was not simply an end to suffering. It was the beginning of new challenges. For a medieval ship, docking meant exposure to bustling trade, strange customs, and dangerous temptations. The sea brought men to new worlds, and those worlds offered both opportunity and peril. The first moments ashore were often the sweetest. Men stumbled down the gangplank, their legs unsteady after so long on shifting decks. The solid ground beneath their feet felt strange, even dizzying, but it was a relief beyond words. The smell of earth, of grass, of cooking fires drifted through the air, sharper and richer than the stale odors of the ship. Crowds gathered along the docks, merchants eager for trade, porters ready to haul cargo, locals curious to see what treasures or strangers the sea had delivered. The noise of the port, with its shouting, clattering, and bustling, was deafening after weeks of nothing but waves and creaks. Trade was the first order of business. Barrels, crates, and sacks were hauled ashore, inspected, and bargained over. Merchants shouted prices, scribes scratched tallies into ledgers, and coins clinked as deals were struck. The cargo might be wool, timber, grain, wine, or salt. Or it might be rarer goods, spices from the east, silks from distant lands, furs from the north. Each voyage brought new wealth to the markets, feeding the endless hunger for trade that drove men to risk their lives at sea. Passengers disembarking added to the chaos. Pilgrims hurried toward shrines or holy sites, their journeys not yet complete. Traders carried their goods into warehouses and stalls. Envoys or soldiers reported to local lords. Every arrival reshaped the port, a ripple of change that spread outward into the town or city. For locals, ships were lifelines to the wider world, bringing not only goods, but news, ideas, and even rumors from distant places. But for sailors, what awaited them on shore was not only business, it was temptation. After so long confined in cramped quarters, they craved indulgence. Taverns and inns near the docks filled quickly with men eager for ale, wine, and food richer than anything they had eaten at sea. Plates of roasted meat, loaves of fresh bread, bowls of fruit, all were devoured with a hunger born of deprivation. The clatter of mugs, the roar of laughter, and the singing of drunken voices echoed deep into the night. Alongside food and drink came other pleasures. Brothels thrived near ports, offering companionship to men starved of women for months. Many sailors spent their wages quickly, indulging in nights of excess before the ship sailed again. These encounters often left behind more than memories. Diseases spread easily, adding new miseries to those already carried from the voyage. Yet few resisted, for temptation was strong, and the promise of pleasure seemed worth the risk after so much hardship. Ports also carried danger. Fights broke out in taverns when sailors from rival ships clashed, their tempers sharpened by drink and weariness. Knives flashed, fists flew, and the cobbled streets ran with blood until guards intervened. Theft was common. 2 merchants cheated, sailors robbed, goods stolen in the confusion. Foreign ports brought even greater risks, for language barriers and unfamiliar customs made misunderstandings frequent, and what seemed harmless to one man could be an insult to another. Disease lurked as well. Crowded docks and towns teemed with people from every corner of the world, each carrying their own ailments. Plague, fever, or pox could spread quickly, carried aboard ships to infect entire crews. What began as relief at landfall could end in sickness that lingered long after the voyage continued. And not every port welcomed strangers. Some towns feared raiders, treating all outsiders with suspicion. Others taxed heavily, demanding bribes or tolls for entry. In times of war, a ship might be seized outright, its cargo confiscated, its men imprisoned or conscripted. A port could be salvation or ruin, depending on politics and fortune. For sailors, though, the call of temptation was always strongest. They had lived for weeks on hardtack and salted meat, endured storms and sickness, labored until their bodies ached. The port offered escape, however brief, from misery. They spent their coin freely, laughed too loudly, and drank too deeply. Many staggered back to the ship penniless, their wages gone in a single night. Others never returned at all, lost in alleys, taken by thieves, or imprisoned for crimes committed in drunken folly. Captains struggled to control this chaos. They needed their crews sober and ready for the next voyage, yet they also knew that denying them relief could spark mutiny. Some imposed strict curfews, flogging men who failed to return on time. Others allowed indulgence, but demanded loyalty afterward. It was a delicate balance, one that shaped the rhythm of every journey. For passengers, encounters in port were more varied. Merchants sought profit, pilgrims sought holy relics, nobles sought alliances. Some marveled at the sights of foreign lands markets filled with strange spices, temples of unfamiliar gods, streets alive with colors and smells they had never known. Others recoiled from the chaos, frightened by the unfamiliar tongues, the jostling crowds, the heat, and the noise. For many, it was their first glimpse of a wider world, and it was overwhelming. For you, the port might seem a relief after the suffering of the sea, but its relief would be fleeting. The noise, the crowds, the dangers, and the temptations would assault your senses, leaving you dizzy and uneasy. The pleasures might tempt you, but they would come at a price: your money, your health, perhaps even your safety. The dangers of the sea did not end at landfall. They simply changed form. And yet, without ports, voyages had no meaning. They were the reason men braved storms, hunger, and disease. They were the gateways of wealth, faith, and adventure, binding distant lands together through trade and exchange. Every port was a meeting place of worlds, a crossroads where cultures mingled, clashed, and reshaped one another. Still, for the ordinary sailor, a port was less about grand connections and more about one night of freedom before returning to the hardships of the sea. And for someone like you, even that one night might prove too much, a whirlwind of temptation, danger, and noise that would leave you longing not for more, but for the quiet safety of home. Chapter 16. Shipwreck and Survival Stories of all the fears that haunted sailors on medieval voyages. None was more dreaded than shipwreck. Storms, pirates, disease, and hunger were constant threats, but shipwreck was sudden and final. One moment the vessel was afloat, carrying its crew across the waves, and the next it was splintering apart, swallowed by the sea. To be cast adrift upon the water, with no land in sight and no hope of rescue, was the nightmare that lingered in every sailor's mind. Shipwrecks came in many forms. Some were the work of storms, when winds tore sails to ribbons and waves hurled ships onto rocks or reefs. Others came from poor navigation, when fog concealed a jagged coast or currents pulled a vessel into shallow waters. Sometimes fire took a ship, flames racing along tarred ropes and wooden decks, until the vessel was a floating torch, forcing men to leap into the sea. Whatever the cause, the result was chaos and terror, men scrambling for survival, while their only sanctuary broke apart beneath their feet. Imagine the moment of disaster. The hull shudders violently, a sound like thunder splitting through wood. Water floods in, cold and merciless. Barrels roll, ropes snap, men shout in panic. The ship tilts, its decks slick with seawater, its masts groaning as they sway. Sailors grab whatever they can: planks, barrels, pieces of broken rigging, anything that might float. The captain shouts orders, but his voice is lost in the roar of waves and the screams of men. And then, with a final groan, the ship begins to sink, its timbers vanishing into the deep. Those who survived the wreck faced a new struggle. Clinging to wreckage, they drifted across the waves, their bodies chilled by wind and water, their mouths parched by thirst. Some prayed, others wept, others simply stared at the horizon with hollow eyes. The sea, vast and indifferent, carried them where it wished. Rescue was rare, for few ships passed close enough to spot survivors. Many floated for days, their strength fading, their numbers dwindling one by one. Survival stories from the Middle Ages were retold in ports and taverns, passed from sailor to sailor. Some spoke of men who clung to barrels for a week before reaching shore, their bodies so wasted they could barely walk. Others told of crews who built makeshift rafts from the wreckage, lashing timbers together with ropes, drifting until the current delivered them to land. These tales became legends, reminders of both the cruelty of the sea and the resilience of those who faced it. One story told of sailors who, after weeks adrift, were forced to eat whatever they could fish caught with bare hands, seaweed floating on the waves, even the bodies of those who had died. Such tales horrified listeners, yet they carried a grim truth. The sea stripped away civility, reducing men to desperation. Survival came at any cost, and judgment was left to God. Not all wrecks left survivors, many vanished without a trace. A ship departed one port, and it was never seen again. Families waited. Months turned to years, but no word arrived. Perhaps the vessel was lost in a storm. Perhaps it struck a reef. Perhaps pirates claimed it and silenced all aboard. The sea kept its secrets well, and countless ships lay buried beneath its waves, their stories known only to the depths. Superstition grew around shipwrecks. Sailors believed that some waters were cursed, claiming vessels with unnatural hunger. Ghost ships were said to appear, spectral reminders of crews lost to the sea, drifting endlessly with no one aboard. Survivors were treated with awe, their tales listened to, as though they had returned from the dead. Some wore amulets to guard against wrecks. Others swore by prayers before departure, but all knew that no charm could truly protect against the sea's fury. For passengers, the fear of shipwreck was overwhelming. They lacked the training of sailors, the knowledge of the sea, the instinct for survival. In panic, many leapt too early, abandoning the ship before all hope was lost, only to drown in the waves. Others clung helplessly to one another, paralyzed by fear. The sailors themselves had little time to help them, for in disaster, each man's life depended on his own strength. Shipwreck revealed the brutal truth that the sea spared no one rich or poor, captain or servant. All were equal in its grasp. Even for those who survived, reaching shore was not always salvation. Many found themselves cast upon desolate coasts, with no food, no shelter, no friendly faces. Some stumbled into forests, only to face wild beasts or hostile locals. Others collapsed upon the sand, their strength gone, never rising again. Survival at sea was only the first step. Survival on land, with nothing but a battered body and a desperate will, was another trial altogether. And yet, for all the terror of shipwrecks, men still told these stories with a kind of reverence. They were proof of the sea's power, yes, but also proof of human endurance. The survivors, though few, became symbols of resilience, their tales inspiring awe and fear in equal measure. To have faced the sea and lived was to stand apart from ordinary men. For you, even the thought of shipwreck would be enough to break your spirit. To feel the deck shatter beneath your feet, to hear the cries of men drowning around you, to cling desperately to a piece of wood while waves crashed over your head, it would be terror beyond measure. And if, by some miracle, you survived, the endless drifting, the thirst, the hunger, the hopeless horizon would surely undo you. A single day of such horror would be more than enough. This was the final, most feared fate of medieval sailors. Not hunger, not disease, not storms, but shipwreck, the sudden end, the ocean's final claim. It was the shadow that followed every voyage, the truth that no man could forget. To sail was to risk it always, and to survive was a miracle. Chapter 17. Faith and Superstition at Sea in the Middle Ages. Men turned to faith and superstition as much as to skill and strength when they faced the sea. For every rope tied, every sail trimmed, every watch kept, there were prayers whispered, charms carried, and rituals performed. Life aboard a medieval ship was hard, uncertain, and often terrifying. Without faith, whether in God, in saints, or in old sailors' lore, many believed they could not endure. Religion was ever present on voyages. Before a ship departed, blessings were often sought from a priest. Holy water might be sprinkled on the deck, prayers spoken over the voyage, and the crew urged to make the sign of the cross as they left the safety of harbor. Many captains carried relics, small bones of saints, fragments of cloth, or crosses carved from holy places. These were treated as talismans, divine shields against storms and shipwreck. Daily prayers were sometimes observed at sea. In calmer moments, sailors gathered on deck to chant hymns or mutter rosaries, their voices mingling with the wind. Pilgrims, who often traveled by ship, prayed fervently throughout, believing that their devotion could win divine favor and safe passage. To many, the voyage itself was an act of faith, a trial endured for spiritual reward. But alongside these pious practices lived the rich world of sailor superstition. The sea was vast and unpredictable, and men filled the gaps of their knowledge with belief. Certain acts were thought to invite disaster. Whistling on deck, for instance, was said to call up storms. Killing a seabird, especially an albatross, was considered a grave offense, believed to bring misfortune upon the entire crew. Speaking the name of certain animals, like rabbits or pigs, was forbidden, as those names were thought unlucky when carried on the wind. Cats, on the other hand, were often seen as lucky. A ship with a cat aboard was believed to be protected, for the creature could sense storms and kept vermin in check. Black cats, feared on land, were sometimes cherished at sea. Sailors swore that a cat's behavior foretold the weather. If it licked its fur against the grain, rain was coming. If it sneezed, a storm might be near. Other superstitions revolved around rituals. Before crossing dangerous waters, sailors might toss coins into the sea as offerings, appeasing the spirits beneath the waves. Some spat into the ocean to show respect. Others swore by charms tied to their wrists or hidden in their clothing. Tattoos, though less common in Europe than elsewhere, were said by some to hold protective power. Sailors did what they could to feel shielded, for the sea seemed alive, listening, and ready to punish disrespect. The figure of Jonah from the Bible loomed large in sailors' minds. Just as Jonah was cast into the sea to calm the storm, sailors believed that sometimes the ocean demanded sacrifice. A particularly unlucky or troublesome man might be blamed for bad weather, whispered about as a Jonah aboard the ship. In extreme cases, men feared such a person might be thrown overboard to save the rest, though whether this ever truly happened is uncertain. Still, the fear of being labeled a Jonah lingered over every voyage. Superstitions also colored how sailors understood natural phenomena. St. Elmo, Spire, the eerie blue glow that sometimes flickered on masts during storms, was seen as a sign of divine presence. Some believed it was the light of the saint himself, protecting them in their darkest hours. Others saw it as a warning. Either way, it filled sailors with awe, reminding them that the sea was more than water and wind. It was a place of mysteries touched by powers beyond their control. Songs and chants held power as well. Work songs kept men moving, but they also carried a kind of magic. Some believed that certain chants calmed the sea, that rhythm itself could soothe the waves. Shouts of hold fast or heave ho were not only orders but incantations, repeated until they became charms of survival. Words mattered, and sailors guarded them carefully, for the sea was thought to listen. Dreams and omens were watched with equal care. A sailor who dreamed of drowning might wake in terror, convinced that death was near. Strange shapes in the clouds, odd behavior of seabirds, even the flickering of lanterns could be read as signs. Men whispered their interpretations, testing whether fortune favored them or doom lay ahead. In such a world of uncertainty, every detail seemed heavy with meaning. Faith and superstition sometimes clashed. Priests and pious captains condemned the old sailor's lore as sinful, urging men to trust only in God. But when storms raged and death seemed close, even the most devout often clutched both rosary and charm, muttering prayers while also spitting into the sea. Belief was not about logic, but about hope, and men took comfort wherever they could find it. For you, unused to such constant danger, these rituals might seem strange. You might laugh at the idea of a cat predicting the weather or a coin calming the sea. But in the heart of a storm, when the ship groaned and the waves roared, you too would reach for anything prayer, superstition, or both that promised safety. The mind, pressed by fear, clings to symbols. For medieval sailors, these symbols were lifelines, threads of meaning stretched across a vast and merciless ocean. The faith and superstition of sailors also shaped their sense of community. To pray together, to share charms, to whisper omens. These bound men as much as ropes and sails did. They reminded one another that they were not alone, that forces beyond human strength might yet carry them through. In this way, faith was not only spiritual but practical. It kept men steady when despair threatened to pull them under. And so, every voyage was more than a physical journey. It was also a spiritual trial, a dance between fear and belief, between the power of God and the mysteries of the sea. For many, it was this balance that kept them alive, not the ropes they pulled or the sails they trimmed, but the hope they held in their hearts. For you, it would be one more challenge impossible to endure: to live each day under the weight of omens, to feel the sea as a living presence, to wonder if your every word or action might invite disaster. It would fray your spirit within hours. Even if you survived the labor and the hunger, the storms and the sickness, the burden of fear and faith would wear you down. And this, too, is why you would not last a single day on a medieval sea voyage. Chapter 18. Why you wouldn't last a day. By now, the hardships of a medieval voyage have revealed themselves in full. Each chapter of the journey has shown another weight, another trial, another reason why the sea was such a cruel master. To step aboard such a ship was not to embark on adventure, but to surrender to an ordeal of body, mind, and spirit. And if you imagine yourself in that world, it becomes clear why you, like most modern people, would not last a single day. From the very first moment, the shock of the ship would overwhelm you. The smell alone, tar, manure, sweat, rot would choke the air. The cramped space, where privacy did not exist, and every inch was crowded, would suffocate. You would stumble as the deck swayed, your stomach rebelling almost instantly, your body betraying you to seasickness. Before even a day had passed, you would be doubled over at the railing, weak, embarrassed, and miserable. Hunger would follow close behind. The hardtack, stale and crawling with weevils, would test your teeth and your courage. The salted meat, greasy and rancid, would turn your stomach even further. The water, foul and green with age, would sicken you with every swallow. To live on such rations, after only a few meals, would seem impossible. Yet this was all that sustained men for weeks on end. Illness would stalk you next. Surrounded by coughing, scratching men, pressed shoulder to shoulder in damp and dirty quarters, you would feel disease waiting in the air. A cut on your hand might fester, a fever might burn, or your gums might swell with the first signs of scurvy. On land, such ailments might be treated, but at sea they were left to linger, weakening the body until it could no longer endure. Labor would exhaust what little strength remained. Ropes to haul, sails to trim, decks to scrub, the work never ended, and discipline was merciless. Your hands would blister, your back would ache, and the whip would remind you that refusal was not an option. Sleep would bring no relief, broken by the groaning of timbers, the scratching of rats, and the shouting of orders at all hours. You would rise each morning already weary, dragged into another day of endless toil. And then there were the storms. Imagine your first encounter, the sky blackening, the wind howling, the waves lifting the ship like a toy. The deck would tilt and heave, rain blinding your eyes, water soaking you to the bone. The fear would choke you, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the air. You would cling to the rail, convinced each wave was the last, your heart pounding with terror. To endure even a single storm would be enough to break you. But even in calmer moments, fear never left. Navigation was uncertain, the stars hidden by clouds, the horizon unchanging. The sense of being lost, of drifting endlessly across a vast and empty ocean, would gnaw at your mind. Every shadow might be a reef, every silence an omen, every strange shape a sea monster waiting to rise. Your imagination, fed by tales of curses and spirits, would not let you rest. Pirates might come next. The sight of a ship on the horizon, closing fast, would send panic through your veins. The clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, the laughter of raiders, these would haunt you long after the fight was done, if you lived to remember them at all. The terror of men's cruelty, added to the terror of nature's fury, would leave you broken in both body and spirit. Even in port, there was little peace. The noise of the market, the temptations of taverns, the risk of theft, disease, or violence, all would overwhelm. Relief would be fleeting, danger never far. And always the ship awaited you again, ready to drag you back into the hardships of the sea. The mind, under such weight, would falter. Loneliness, isolation, monotony, all would press heavily upon you. The endless horizon would dull your spirit. The absence of loved ones would hollow your heart. The sameness of each day would leave you numb. Faith and superstition might offer some comfort, but they would also deepen your fear, making every mistake seem fated, every sound an omen. The sea would not only test your body, it would unravel your mind. And finally, there was shipwreck. Even if you had survived all else, the hunger, the storms, the disease, one moment of bad fortune could undo it all. A reef unseen, a sudden gale, a spark of fire, and the ship would be gone, splintered and swallowed. To cling to wreckage in a vast sea, to drift helplessly under the burning sun or freezing night, would be the last and most terrible trial. This was the reality of a medieval voyage. It was not romantic adventure, not noble exploration, but a constant battle for survival. Each day demanded everything a man had, and many gave their lives despite it. To last even a week was an achievement. To last a month was a miracle. To return home alive was rare enough to be celebrated. For you, with your modern comforts, your clean water, your fresh food, your safe home, the contrast would be too great. You would not last a day, not against the smell, the sickness, the hunger, the fear. Your body would falter, your mind would weaken, your spirit would break. And in that truth lies the final lesson of the medieval sea voyage. It was not made for the faint of heart. It was a crucible of endurance, a test of survival, and a reminder of how harsh life once was. And so, as you imagine yourself aboard such a ship, rocking upon the waves, surrounded by noise, smell, fear, and toil, remember this: the men who lived such lives were stronger than we can easily imagine. They endured what most of us could not. And for you, for anyone living now, a single day in their world would be enough to prove it. And so, our voyage draws to an end. You have walked the deck of a medieval ship in your imagination, breathed its foul air, eaten its meager rations, and endured its storms. You have seen the hardships that men faced when they left the safety of land and surrendered themselves to the vast, uncertain sea. For them, this was daily life. For us, it is almost unthinkable. Each chapter has shown a different trial. The cramped quarters, where privacy was lost and vermin thrived. The food and water, so foul and insufficient that hunger was never satisfied. The seasickness that weakened the body, the diseases that spread without cure, and the labor that bent backs and blistered hands. You have felt the terror of storms, the uncertainty of navigation, and the cruelty of pirates. You have seen the strict hierarchy aboard, the noise that never ceased, the isolation that gnawed at the mind, and the dangers of reefs, fog, and ice. You have stepped ashore into bustling ports filled with trade and temptation, only to be cast again upon the sea, where shipwreck always waited as the final threat. For medieval sailors, this was reality. It was not an adventure to be chosen lightly, but a necessity of survival, of trade, of war, of faith. They endured because they had no other choice. And though many perished, some returned scarred, hardened, but alive. Their endurance is a reminder of how resilient the human spirit can be when faced with the harshest of trials. For you, for us, the thought of living even a single day in such conditions is nearly impossible. Our lives are softened by comforts that medieval sailors could never imagine. Clean water, safe food, warm shelter, quiet rest, these are blessings so ordinary to us, and yet so rare upon the sea. To step back into their world, even in thought, is to understand just how hard existence once was, and how much we take for granted now. As we close this journey, take a deep breath. Imagine the waves still rocking gently, but now without fear. Imagine the sails above you, no longer straining, but resting in calm air. Picture the horizon, endless and still, no longer a place of danger but of peace. The voyage has ended, and you are safe. Let that thought bring you comfort as you drift into rest. Thank you for joining me on this long passage through history. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you'll never miss another journey into the past. And tell me in the comments what part of this voyage struck you the most, or when you listen to these stories. Do you play them as you drift off to sleep, or while you lie awake in the quiet hours of the night? I love hearing your experiences, and your suggestions help guide the voyages still to come. For now, let the hardships of medieval sailors fade into the distance. Their world was filled with struggle, but yours tonight can be filled with calm. Close your eyes. Let the sea carry you not into storms, but into dreams, steady and safe. Good night, and thank you for listening. Until next time, may the tides of history bring you peace.